So in this slideshow, we're going to look at consumer surplus. We'll look at producer surplus in a separate slideshow. So consumer surplus is something which comes up in multiple choice quite a lot, and it's also something that you can write about as part of your essay. So if a question is asking for the effect on the consumer, one of the things you might say is what happens to consumer surplus. So if the question is perhaps about a tax added to the good, the tax is going to increase the price of the good, and you might go on to talk about what's going to happen to the consumer surplus. So the definition is the difference between the price that consumers are prepared to pay and the price that they actually pay. So it's about how much the consumer values the good at. So we've got an example here, a can of Coke costing £1.50. No, the consumer's prepared to pay £1.50, but the can of Coke costs 90p. So their consumer surplus will be 60p. Now it might be that on a hot day, the consumer values the can of Coke at £2, in which case the consumer surplus would be £1.10. It might be on a very cold day, consumer doesn't want a can of Coke and only values it at 50p, in which case they won't buy the can of Coke and therefore there'll be no consumer surplus. Different consumers value items at different prices, so we're all going to have a different consumer surplus. If the price of the can of Coke increases from 90p to £1, the consumer surplus is going to fall from 60p to 50p. So consumer surplus will change if the price of the good changes. And we're going to have a look at consumer surplus on a diagram, and then we're going to look at how consumer surplus changes using a diagram. So here's a diagram of consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is always going to be a triangle. It's the triangle above the price. So in this example here, the price of the good is 18. We don't really need to worry about the 30 and the 20. The price of the good is 18. So we draw the price on and then we shade the triangle above the price of 18, and that is our total consumer surplus for all of our consumers, not just for one consumer, but for all of our consumers. If we now have a look at how consumer surplus changes when there's a change in price, we'll draw a diagram for that, which I'll explain as I go. So we start off with our demand curve. Always remembering to label your demand curve, label your axes. So when the price is P1, then our consumer surplus, remember we said it was a triangle, the consumer surplus is going to be the triangle above the price line. If the price increases to P2, then the consumer surplus is now going to be the triangle above the red price line. That means we've got a change in consumer surplus of this bit here, the trapezium. So remember, you've got a shade in this triangle bit as well. So it's the whole trapezium, which is the change, and that is a reduction. So you don't want to say the change, you need to specify whether it's an increase or a decrease. In this case, it's a decrease in consumer surplus. So consumer surplus has fallen due to the increase in price. If price was to fall, consumer surplus would increase. So the yellow trapezium is the change in consumer surplus. Now, what you'll often find in multiple choice questions is that they confuse things by putting on more than one curve. So we've just looked at it with one curve. So we've just looked at it with the demand curve and no supply curve on there. Now, if you're presented with a multiple choice question and you've got lots of curves on there, it can be a little bit confusing. So I always find it helpful just to draw yourself one demand curve, shading in your consumer surplus, just to remind yourself what consumer surplus is. Now, the diagram on the left, the price has increased, like we did on the previous page, from A to D, because the supply curve shifted from S1 to S2. So we use the same colours as before. The consumer surplus at the price of A is the blue. Consumer surplus when price moves up to D is the red. And then our change in consumer surplus, which is again, it's a reduction, is the yellow. Now the one on the right is a little bit more confusing, right? So Our original consumer surplus is, because we've got two demand curves this time, so that makes it harder. So our original consumer surplus is at price A, and we're using demand curve D, so it's going to be this area. Our new consumer surplus, now we're using demand curve D2. That's why you've got to be really careful here. So we're using demand curve D2. Our new equilibrium price is at G. So our equilibrium price has actually increased to G, and we're using this new demand curve. So we'll do our line here, and our consumer surplus is going to be that red area. It's now not so straightforward to say what the change in consumer surplus is, because we've got too many overlapping bits, so we can't really say what our consumer surplus is in terms of an area. But what we can say is we can use the, like they've done here, so the original consumer surplus is ABC, the blue bit, and the new consumer surplus is GHI. And you can see that the new consumer surplus looks to be bigger, the red looks to be bigger than the blue, so there has been an increase in consumer surplus.